This is Joshua Hart here for Seconds Out. Delighted to be joined by Andy Clarke on this evening. Andy, first time in a while I've spoke to you. How's everything been?
Yeah, good, good. Just enjoying the sunshine. Got a few days off this week, or I've had a few days off this week, so we've been kind of clearing out the house a bit. I've been to the tip quite a lot today, which was it's like being a removal man, which is not a job I envy. It's tough work. Like just always banging your knees and elbows on stuff and skinning your knuckles and just lifting awkward, heavy stuff and down corridors where I haven't quite got enough room and everything. It's not been, it's not my second calling, I'll tell you that much. But yeah, I know it's good. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. I've watched loads and loads of the Olympics, really enjoyed that. Um, and we've still got a slightly quieter time of it in August, which is normal, and then when you hit September, you get back up and running. So it's kind of, as the longer I've been doing this, the more I've realised that when you do get some time off, because I've always been freelance, you see, and you have that freelance mentality where too much time off, and no matter how well things are going, you get a bit kind of like, oh, I should be doing something. I should be making some moves. I should be I should be strategizing. But you need to try and enjoy it, and I've definitely enjoyed it. So that's been really good.
I was gonna say, when you think about it, we get to the little summer period, August, that's normally when, it's 6 weeks holidays, everyone's off school, a lot of people off college. It's kind of like boxers almost go into a little bit of a summer break. We get into August and we've only got, I think we've had two British cards this month. Obviously, we had Callum Simpson versus Zhilei, York Hall tomorrow night where I'll be. But apart from that, it's a very quiet period in boxing at the moment, isn't it?
It generally is, yeah. It's kind of more all year round now, but it used to be the case that pretty much nobody would do any cards until maybe kind of mid-February for the very basic reason, and it was this basic. The fighters just didn't really want to train over Christmas, which I completely understand. But now you generally get something kind of mid-January, and things move on from there. July and August are busier now than they used to be. Queensbury, I think, have capitalized well on the kind of period in between the Euros and the Olympics. I think they've been quite clever with that because they had shows on the 20th and the 27th. Resorts World with Nathan Heaney against Brad Pauls, and then a week after Joyce against Chisora. So two good cards, two kind of arena cards, and they did them back to back at a point where there wasn't really that much going on. I think the Olympics had just started on July the 27th. So that's a clash you do in an ideal world try and avoid, because I think the Olympics is probably the ultimate numbers killer, particularly when it's somewhere like Paris, which is basically the same time zone, and it's on terrestrial TV, and it's on seemingly, it feels like it's not on 24 hours a day, but the highlights come on late at night, and it's on from pretty much 8 o'clock in the morning till about midnight, isn't it? And they're ticking over with a couple of York Hall ones. Yeah, you'll be hot at York Hall tomorrow night. I know you know that, but
Very, very
sometimes,
aware.
even though you know it, there's no sometimes real preparing for it. But yeah, it'll be warm there, definitely.
Well, you mentioned Joyce versus Chisora, and like I said, it's been a while since we've last spoke, so I want to just quickly grab a few of your thoughts on that one. Not necessarily about the fight itself, but looking at the aftermath of it. Obviously, Joyce and Chisora, when we talk about them, they're two fighters who have always been spoken about in recent years as fans are unsure as whether they should retire or not. For Joe Joyce, we'll start off with him. What do you believe his future looks like now following that defeat to Derek Chisora?
It's difficult because that's three defeats in the last four, and I think the one against Chisora is damaging because against Zhang, that catapulted Zhang to the top of the heavyweight division, and since then, he's gone on to beat Deontay Wilder and whatever people might have thought of Wilder at that stage. And I don't think he was the Wilder of old. I think he'd lost his edge by that point. He still did what he did. To lose to Chisora is, with the greatest respect to Derek, you have to beat Chisora to be regarded as a legitimate top 15, say top 20 fighter, I would say. And he wasn't able to do it. I thought he was going to do it. I thought he was going to close it out the last couple of rounds. I had it level, I think, after 8 rounds. And then the knockdown was huge because he looked like he was probably going to win that round again, mostly on work rate. And then he found himself on his back and he wasn't really hurt, but it turned a 10-9 to him into a 10-8 for Chisora. And then at that point, he was pretty much done unless he could get the knockout in the final round, which, to be honest with you, it never really looked like he was going to be able to do. And I'm not entirely sure whether he's going to get a fight next that he's really going to want, because I think what awaits him now is somebody like Italma, where he'll get thrown in with Italma and they'll say to him, listen, this is a route back. This guy's one of the most highly touted heavyweights in the division. If you could beat him, then even though he isn't currently, and he can't be because he hasn't beaten enough people to be considered as such, although he isn't a top 15 fighter, people are that high on him that a win over him will really mean something, because I don't think he's going to get too many opportunities outside of that where people are trying to use his name and trying to get his name on their record. That's just where he is, I think. And that's a pretty sobering place to be when not that long ago everything was going great. But I think that is where he is. So we'll see. We'll see. But it was, yeah, it was a blow. It was a real blow. It wasn't one I saw coming either. I thought he'd win that fight.
How frustrating is it for Joe, especially when you look at his defeats to Zhilei Zhang, you know, there were fights where it was a very conclusive result, you know. Obviously, I'm going to reference your book here. You know, you've got your book, The Knockout, and it's the most decisive moment in sport. When he lost to Zhang, obviously the first fight on an injury, but the second fight obviously by knockout. With Chisora, he was always in the fight, and it's just you could say he got outworked, couldn't you?
Yeah, you could. But what I found interesting about the Chisora defeat, though, was basically he got beaten because of a knockdown. He didn't get knocked out, but he did get knocked down. And that ultimately, on my card anyway, was why he lost. And again, that just kind of illustrates the point that you can't just keep getting hit the way that he does, because Zhang was able to cause his eye to blow up in the first fight and then was able to knock him out in the second fight. Chisora hasn't got that kind of power, but he's got enough to knock you down if you let him hit you like that as often as Joyce did. And again, I think that's another kind of salutary tale right there. If you're that open, then a good heavyweight might not knock you out, but they'll put you down. And it was getting put down that cost him the fight. So again, it was the same problem, I think, that we saw against Zhang, not exploited as ruthlessly, but exploited enough. I just don't really know if he can change at this point. I wouldn't have thought he probably can, to be honest. As we said before, it's a difficult position that he's in. Because I mean, we'd all kind of begun to think, and it's one of those things when you look at it in hindsight, you think, oh, come on, like, we should have known better. But he just did seem that maybe he could be that person who just was always able to walk through punches. You knew it wasn't going to be good for him long term, but maybe he was going to be that person. That wouldn't mean that he would never get beaten, but that maybe he would never get stopped. But in the heavyweight division, dining out on your chin like that or relying on your chin like that, it's a very dangerous thing to try and do.
And for the victor of the night, Derek Chisora, obviously that was his farewell fight at the O2 Arena. He says he's got 2 fights left. Who do you believe, or who would you like to see him in the ring with for his last 2 fights?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. If you're picking up any background noise, people watching this, my daughter's in the room with me. I'm in charge of her at the minute, and I'm just kind of gambling on the fact that she's going to stay quiet, which she sort of is. That's a good one with Chisora, because I think, given the career he's had, I think he's earned the right to kind of choose almost. I do think a fight with Dillian Whyte would be tremendous. I think a third fight with Dillian Whyte would be tremendous. I don't know what the situation with Dillian regarding the failed test, the positive test, whether that's really been addressed, because I think we all felt that maybe we wouldn't see him again, but then obviously we did, because he boxed in Dublin, didn't he?
Yes.
Where he would stand with the British Boxing Board of Control currently, I don't really know. He'll be suspended. I'd imagine that's true, but whether there's anything pending, hearing wise or anything like that. I don't know, because obviously that fight, I say, would have to be in the UK, but that's not really true anymore, is it? That's the kind of big fight that could end up somewhere else. But that's one for us, isn't it? That's got to be one for us. I was at both of those first two. The first one was on the undercard of Joshua Molina, late 2016, and it was a brilliant fight that could have gone either way. And then the second one was at the O2 just before Christmas one year, packed house, magnificent atmosphere. Again, a really, really good fight. Chisora was ahead, doing really well. Then he got knocked out. It was a really good heavyweight fight. They're not where they were, those two, but I think they might be. I think they're pretty evenly matched, to be honest, because they both had hard careers. They're both. I don't think it's a rude thing to say. They're both faded compared to where they were and what they were, but I think they're on a fairly level playing field there. So I would like to see that. I think that would be that's the dream match for him, I think. And then if he were to have one more after that, I just don't want him to go in too deep. I mean, people kind of feared for him against Joyce, and I understood why. I just don't want to see him go in too deep, because he's given an awful lot to the sport. He's been handsomely rewarded for it. That's also true. You know, he's made lots of money, Derek Chisora. But what I don't want to see is somebody like him get a hiding in either of these last two fights. So what would be the point of that? What could possibly be the point of that? He doesn't need to prove to anyone how tough he is. We all know that. So let's get him in fights where he's got an even chance of winning.
And just moving away from those two and looking at some of the big news this week, while it's quiet inside the boxing ring, it's definitely not quiet on the news front. I think the big headline of the week has been a bit of feud on social media between Canelo and Turki Alalshikh. From what you've seen and what you've read, what do you make of this feud between them?
I don't make too much of it, to be honest. There's big characters in boxing, like there are in any sport, and not everybody is going to be on the same page and get on all of the time. And particularly if you're a big name fighter and you've got somebody who's come on the scene in the way that Turki Alalshikh has, and you haven't yet been a part of it, that could be down to you, or maybe you haven't been asked possibly quite as quickly as you thought you would be. And then there's a little bit of ego that comes into that, or maybe just generally think to yourself, listen, I don't need to march to the beat of anybody's drum. You know, I'm Canelo. I'm my own ecosystem, universe, solar system, economy, everything. You know, I'm the traveling circus. I decide where the tent goes down and whether I get in it and how much it's going to cost to get me in there. Not you. There's plenty of that going on, I think, in discussions for any fight. Gervonta Davis is one as well, who looked like he was probably going to fight in Saudi, and then at the minute it would look like he probably isn't. These are big name fighters who, and there aren't many, who actually don't financially, they don't really need Turki Alalshikh. And you can't say that about many people, but they don't, do they? Because Davis does great pay-per-view numbers in the United States, where he's a big star. Canelo does big numbers wherever he boxes, but generally in the United States, because the time difference is right for Central and South America. So I just think it's that, really. I just think it's a bit of ego, a bit of posturing, and you're always going to get that. You know, it's just two kings of the jungle, if you like, just kind of just beating their chests a bit. I'd imagine it'll get resolved and we'll see him on a Riyadh season show. I'd be really surprised if we didn't.
What do you make of Turkey coming out on Twitter, though, and saying that Canelo's scared to face the likes of David Benavidez and Terence Crawford?
I don't think that that's necessarily going to help the disagreement get settled soon, possibly, because nobody likes to hear that. But I don't know if fighters like Canelo really take that kind of stuff to heart. I think he wouldn't really appreciate it, but at the same time, you look at what he's achieved, and you're always going to have people trying to pick holes in anything that you do. And I think he'll just be, just roll his eyes probably if he's even seen it, or probably say that he hasn't even seen it. Yeah, it's Crawford was talking about it the other day as well, wasn't he? And saying, Canelo saying that there's no point fighting me because he won't get the credit because I'm too small. And then he said, well, He fought Mayweather, who was smaller than him. He fought Amir Khan, who was smaller than him. You know, he's been fighting smaller guys his whole career. I don't know if I would pick too many holes in Canelo's career, to be honest. When you're a massive, massive A side, you do get to call the shots, but that's just the way of the world, isn't it? Yeah, it is quite an interesting move though from Turki Alalshikh to actually offer quite pointed criticism of somebody. It's kind of interesting that he's happy to go there. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and I mean, it is entertaining, isn't it? It's good for us.
And then steering our way back into the heavyweight division, one of the big fights that we saw on the most recent Riyadh season card, Martin Bakole took on Jared Anderson in a fight that was kind of billed as the breakout fight for Jared Anderson, but definitely not an easy breakout fight, and that's what we learned when they got in the ring. Obviously, Martin Bakole stopped Jared, and then since then, he's mainly been coming out and saying that he wants to face Zhang next. How do you see that fight unfolding between Bakole and Zhang if it is to get made?
God, I think that'd be great. I spoke to him for the Sky podcast earlier this week, and I heavily fancied him against Jared Anderson. A few of us did, because Anderson, although he has an awful lot of ability, the way things have been going for him outside of the ring, it seems to me like he's pushed the self-destruct button a bit. As fighters sometimes do that when they get to the brink of something really big, and it scares them a bit. They get a bit scared of success. It sounds like an odd thing to say, but it does happen. It happens in all sorts of different walks of life, really. You realize that the pressure that is ahead of you, if you get there, you realize the expectation, you realize the sacrifices, you realize it all, because it's hard. You know, it's a very hard life to lead, and a hard line to path to walk, even though the rewards potentially are huge. Personally, I think that's what happened with him, and he kind of hit that self-destruct because it's a little bit easier if you don't quite make it, if you've got an excuse ready for why it didn't happen, rather than completely go for it, go all in, give it your all. But then if you still come up short, what then? You know, how do you explain that one? So I think psychologically for fighters, it can be very difficult for some of them when they're backed as being the next big thing and everybody has loads of belief in them. And then maybe the belief they have in themselves isn't quite on the same level. And Bakole, I thought, was a terrible fight for him to take, to be perfectly honest. And it started badly for him and didn't really get too much better. And Bakole, I think, was quite surprised that he hung in there as long as he did. He was even more surprised that he seemed to want to stand and trade with him. And he is a real problem, Bakole, because he's massive. I do kind of wonder whether he needs to be quite as heavy as he is, but at the same time, his punch output's really good. You know, he throws a lot of punches, and it doesn't really take much out of himself whilst he's doing it. He just kind of lets his hands flow, really. I'd fancy him against Zhilei. I'd fancy him against Zhilei, I think. Agit Cabello was another fight we mentioned to him and said, how about that? You know, he's kind of not come from nowhere exactly, but people weren't expecting him necessarily to do what he did in those two fights against Makhmudov and Frank Sanchez. And I'd be quite keen on that one as well. I think that'd be an interesting fight. But Bakole, you know, Billy Nelson has been saying for a long time that he's the real deal, and he is. You know, there's no two ways about it. He is.
I spoke to Johnny Nelson earlier this week over Zoom, and I asked him for his heavyweight top five, and he put obviously Oleksandr Usyk at number one, no doubt, and then he had Anthony Joshua at number two, and then Tyson Fury at number three, which has caused a bit of a shock to people. What do you think of that top three?
So what did they have? Usyk, Joshua, then Fury?
Yeah, so yeah, Usyk number one, Joshua number two, Fury number three.
No, I couldn't agree with that. I think I know how he's got there. I think what he's done there is he's gone on kind of current form, and he's thinking that Fury has dropped off with the performance against Ngannou and then the defeat against Usyk, and he'll feel that Fury is on the slide, whereas Joshua's going in the opposite direction, and therefore right now he puts Joshua ahead of Fury. I don't have any real problem with that logic. It's just not how I would do rankings, because I think you have to go on what's actually happened and they've boxed a common opponent recently enough for it to mean something, and Fury was closer to Usyk than Joshua was either of the two times they boxed, I think. I mean, Joshua was pretty close the second time. You could argue that Joshua's second crack at Usyk and Fury's performance against Usyk, in terms of the scores, were probably about the same. But I did feel in that fight against Usyk that Fury at the midway point looked like he was going to take over, and that he could, take Usyk to a place he'd never been to before, and maybe stop him in the second half. And the fact that he couldn't just shows you what kind of a bloke we're dealing with Usyk. So I mean, I would have Usyk, Fury. I know I probably would put AJ third, but again, if you're looking at what people have actually done recently, he looked great against Wallin and Ngannou, but is that better than Joseph Parker beating Deontay Wilder and Zhilei Zhang? And you'd have to say no. So if I was going to do it via my own method, I would probably have to put Parker above Joshua, even though Joshua beat Parker, but that was quite a long time ago.
Fair enough. And then Oleksandr Usyk has come out in a recent interview and said that he has no right to deny Joshua of a third fight with him, as Anthony Joshua helped him become even more famous. That was Oleksandr Usyk's words. But if a third fight is to get materialized in the future between Joshua and Usyk, how does AJ go about trying to beat Usyk for a third time?
I think this is easier said than done, but what I think he needs to do is just dismiss those first two fights as fights that happened to somebody else, because at that point he wasn't, I don't think, in the same headspace that he's in now. That's not to say that you don't try and learn stuff from them. Of course you do, but you just say, listen, that was a different person then. And just try to jettison all the kind of baggage that inevitably comes from losing twice to the same person, because there's just no way that it doesn't. You have to try and leave that at the door. That's really, really, really critical. He's got a different training team, and he does seem to be in a different headspace to what he was then. And you look at the fight against Fury, where, as I say, Usyk looked like, well, he was having to dig really, really, really deep. Can you take him to that place? Can you keep that work rate and impose that size for slightly longer than Fury was able to do it? It's going to be difficult, because when you lose to somebody twice and he's that good, and Usyk, these days I do think is pretty extraordinary, to be honest. I mean, the boxing ability was always there. We always knew that. But the sheer will to win and the toughness of him is on a level that you don't very often see. And that is still so, so important, because when he sat on his stool before the start of that 7th round, he knows, I've got to go somewhere now I've never been before. I'm going to lose this fight. And he did it. He did it. And when you're dealing with someone like that, Christ, they take some beating. They really, really do. But I think Joshua would, if Joshua beats Dubois and gets that IBF title, and then Usyk beats Fury again, then of course it's for undisputed. So no one in their right mind could say that, you shouldn't take that third fight. But I mean, Usyk could be a heavy favourite.
Obviously, you mentioned both having upcoming fights, upcoming opponents. We'll start off looking at Anthony Joshua versus Daniel Dubois. Obviously, a lot of the talk's been about Anthony Joshua. Obviously, is a bit of a heavy favourite coming into it. But how does Daniel Dubois go about beating Anthony Joshua?
No fear is the most important thing with him. It doesn't. You can't afford to be gung ho or reckless. And I watched his fight against Hrgovic, and he can't take the right hands from Hrgovic from Joshua that he took from Hrgovic. But it's different fights for different opponents, different approaches for different opponents. And I don't know whether, I doubt it was Don Charles's plan that he would get hit by that right hand quite as much as he did. But maybe they did say to him, listen, this guy doesn't crack as hard as people say he does. You're probably going to have to wear a few here, but we can do this. And then when you do wear a few and it turns out you can do it, and it's not really troubling you, and you realize that is the best way to do it, is to break his heart that way, And then once you've done that, once he realizes he's not going to be able to keep you off, then you can get to work. That's not going to work against everybody, and I'm sure they're not planning to try and do that against Joshua. But he does have to have that attitude that I think he has now developed after the win against Miller, where he proves to himself that he can dig it out when it gets tough. Because I did wonder at one point in that fight whether he was going to go under, and he didn't. And then against Hrgovic, again, he's taken that to a different kind of level, and that self-belief is absolutely critical. If you don't have that, you've got nothing basically. And he's got to back himself to land on him. I think he will start quick. I think he will go after Joshua, and I think he's right to, because if that's what he does, because the question that people will still have about Anthony is what will happen when someone gets on him and maybe makes him panic a bit. It sounds like a mad thing to say that someone as experienced as Joshua would panic, but maybe the odd flashback will still be there from Madison Square Garden. Maybe not. Maybe he's put that completely in the dustbin now. But that's what Dubois will be thinking. He'll be thinking all this talk of a new AJ and AJ comeback, blah 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 blah, because in these fights no one's really landed anything. Franklin didn't really land anything. Helenius didn't really land anything. You didn't manage to knock Franklin out. You took Helenius out 6 or 7 rounds deep against a bloke who'd taken the fight at about a week's notice. Wallin, yeah, okay, you stepped on him and that was great, but you put him in a shell quite early. Was he ever all that? This is what they'll be saying. They'll be thinking. And Ngannou, yeah, he did what he did against a really under par Fury, but ultimately you were in with a Norton 1 novice and you knocked him out. Big whoop. That's what they'll be saying to Daniel Dubois. And that's what you need to be saying to him. And just say, listen, you get out there, you believe in yourself. Don't just be fighting with your face, but get on him. And let's see what happens when a big solid banger tests out his whiskers again. That's what they'll be saying to him. That's what they'll be saying to him. And I don't think it's a fight that's going to last all that long, if I'm honest, but I think it'll be very lively while it does last.
Who do you think comes out on top between Anthony Joshua and Daniel Dubois?
I think if you're looking at it sensibly, you have to make Joshua a favourite. I think you do. But having said that, most people were making Hrgovic a favourite against Dubois. One second. Hey,
no
hey, come on, just relax. Most people were making Hrgovic a favourite against Dubois, and they were kind of right to as well. But I just had a sneaky feeling that night that Dubois was in a good place and he can maybe get something done. I think they're both in a good place, and I think that's what really makes for a good fight. I think the build-up's going to be good. I think it's going to be big, by the time it comes around, because Joshua back in this country, back at Wembley against a fellow Brit, and Dubois is completely legit because he beat Hrgovic. But even if he hadn't, for the vast majority of people who are going to tune into that fight, they don't really care because they just want to see AJ and Daniel Dubois. Who's Daniel Dubois? They'll find out and they think, all right, he's had a couple of losses, but nothing, no big deal. One was to Usyk. Well, yeah, of course, Usyk's the king. Never mind the other one. And he's had some good wins. And the undercard is absolutely tremendous as well. So I do think that is really, I think that's going to be big by the time it comes around. I'm really looking forward to it.
Very just quickly then, looking at Usyk versus Fury too, not necessarily looking at the fight itself, but what's on the line. Do you feel that if Fury is to lose again, that could be it for him and he could retire?
It's always hard to say with him because, when he said that he was going to retire post the, when was it he said that? He came back against Chisora, didn't he? I think after the fight against Dillian White? I think it was after that he said that he was going to retire. I believed him. I think he meant it at the time, but then a few months later, obviously he decides that he needs to keep going. So I don't think it was some kind of a stunt. It's perfectly acceptable to make a decision and then change your mind a few months later, particularly with something like professional sport where you are a long time retired. So I don't really know is the answer to that. I think because that Joshua fight would always be there. I think he would then be very keen to see what would happen. Let's say Joshua has beaten Dubois. Let's just say he has. Then Tyson loses to Oleksandr Usyk. And then those two are going to fight. But then Fury's there still waiting for the winner, especially if it's Joshua, because we all want to see that fight. And people will always want to see it, regardless of their recent records and the circumstances. I think that's fair to say. So whilst that's still potentially out there, then there will always be something to kind of draw him back in. So I wouldn't necessarily say that he might say that he's going to retire after Usyk if he loses a second time, but I don't think he would stay that way.
And then very lastly, just looking at the Olympics, it seems that boxing won't be on the 2028 Olympic cycle. How damaging is it taking Olympic boxing away from these up and coming amateurs?
It would be terrible. It would be really, really terrible. And it's not just because some huge stars have been created through the Olympic Games who then go on to reach the peak of the sport and become, massive global sporting icons. You go back to, Cassius Clay as he was then when he won a gold medal. Joe Frazier did it. George Foreman did it. Lennox Lewis did it. I'm just talking heavyweights here. Anthony Joshua's done it. Vladimir Klitschko's done it. They turn pro ready-made megastars. It's not just that. The much more important thing is that if boxing ceases to be an Olympic sport, then it doesn't get Olympic funding, basically. The level of funding will be cut dramatically, I would imagine, and that funding does trickle down to the clubs. As a result, some clubs will go under because they're barely surviving at the moment. And then youngsters who would have gone to that club won't because it isn't there, and they'll play football instead. And that's where it'll be really felt. That's where it'll be really felt. And a lot of people don't seem to really understand that. And it's massively frustrating. So it would have a big effect. I'm actually optimistic that it will be in Los Angeles. It's not in the scheduling yet, and it's not in any of the publicity yet, but that's because the IOC have this issue they need to resolve. And in March, as I understand it, they will announce who their new governing body, who they recognize as the new governing body for international amateur boxing, will be. It can only really be World Boxing, who've signed a few more countries today, actually. And I think we've got to 42 on their roster now. And I think they will stick with them. And I think that boxing will be in Los Angeles because the IOC do want boxing. They just don't want the International Boxing Association, which has run elite international amateur boxing since the 1970s. They just don't want them for a number of reasons. It's just we don't really got time to kind of elucidate them all. But they decided without any doubt, and there was no going back, that they do not want them. But if World Boxing can get enough countries on their roster and are able to organise competitions and get a schedule going and then organise Olympic qualifying, even if in 2028 they still don't have all the big nations on their roster and therefore it's a slightly diluted competition, I think the IOC will be okay with that and they will go with that. So I've been really worried about this for a long time, but I do now think that the boxing will continue at the Olympics, but it's going to be a messy and possibly quite long drawn out power struggle, because what we'll have to wait and see basically is what are the likes of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Cuba, China, who won between them. Kazakhstan had a bit of a disaster actually, and Cuba only won one gold medal, but Uzbekistan and China won 8 between them out of the 13. What are they going to do? Because the IOC will say, if you continue to box for IBA, the IBA in their competitions, that means that you cannot box in the Olympics. If you want to box in the Olympics, you have to join World Boxing. You've got to make your decision. You can't do what you did for the last Olympics, which is box in all the IBA competitions, of which there are loads, and they are really well run, I have to say that, and there's prize money. You can't do that and then just qualify for the Olympics and do both. We can't. We're not going to allow it. that's a massive decision that they've got to make, and there'll probably be quite a lot of battles basically between national boxing federations and their national Olympic committees, because the National Olympic Committee will want them to go to the Olympics and be an Olympic sport. The National Boxing Federation might, in a lot of countries, have other ideas, because, you know, IBRA have been very generous with funding, for example. So it's a real interesting one. If you get into the bones of it, if people are interested in doing that, then you'll find out exactly what's been happening. But yeah, it's one to keep an eye on.
Just want to quickly grab one more thought from you. You mentioned the funding getting cut if Olympic boxing is to get scrapped off and the effect it will have on local clubs. Is that where we would like to see, the government step in? Because there's always so much talk when you speak to young kids and coaches at these amateur clubs of not just how good boxing is for you physically, but mentally and the discipline that it teaches you. Is this where we might need to see a step up from some of the notable names in boxing to try and save these clubs? We see Matchroom doing a lot of work, for example, but we need to see a real big effort to keep these amateur clubs open so we can keep developing new stars for our sport and keeping our sport afloat.
Yeah, but basically, yeah. And I don't know how much people really do, whether a lot of it's just talk. Like you say, I think Eddie was at something yesterday, wasn't he?
Yes.
Went to a club, went to Lions, I think, didn't he? And they do that, and credit to them for doing it. Boxer have got Maverick Stars who they support, who do a lot of work with amateur clubs. Queensbury do it as well. Boxwise, I think they.
Yeah. I was going to say they've just signed with someone.
Yeah, they signed with Boxwise. So all professional promoters are aware of it. The only problem is that they're just really, really busy entities in and of themselves. And with the whole Olympic thing, I don't think people have really understood or realized just how serious it's got. Like I said, I think it's going to be okay, but it could easily not have been okay, and it could still not be okay. But those clubs are absolutely crucial, because that's where everyone starts. Everyone starts that way. And it's not true to say that every professional who makes it to a high level has had a long and storied amateur career, but almost all of them have had an amateur career. They might not have done brilliantly well, but they still started at their local BC and they got carded and they boxed and they learned that way. So like I say, sometimes with varying degrees of success, but those fights, that initial schooling was really, really important. And also, just as you say, what it does for people generally, because at those clubs, producing champions is great and everybody wants to do that. But in a way, it's almost not even really about that. It's about all the people you get through the doors and who you help in other ways. They come through the doors, and if they keep coming through the doors, then a few months later, they've kind of changed. They're different. You know, they found a community. They found a bit more self-confidence. They found their voice a little bit. They're a little bit more comfortable in their own skin, a bit more comfortable around other people. And that's a massive win if you can do things like that. A massive win. But it does worry me sometimes that maybe there's a fundamental lack of understanding about where it actually is that fighters come from, because that's where they come from. They come through the clubs. And they're absolutely crucial that as many of them stay open as possible. There's more of them than people think. They're still quite old school in that they don't really advertise much. It's still quite word of mouth. A lot of them aren't really online in any kind of particularly effective way, just because there's a handful of people doing everything. So yeah, it's really important.
Andy, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, and hopefully we can catch up again soon. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, and hopefully maybe next time, there won't be quite so much. You should see this. You should see the state of this room. It's unbelievable. It's just like my printer's to my right hand side. She's pulled all the paper out of the printer and just thrown it all over the room. But it's such is life.
Andy, cheers. Thank you very much.